Thank you, Frank. Um, well, I've been asked to talk about the role of regulatory systems and the impact of regulatory systems on getting technologies to farmers, and I'm going to focus most of my comments on the impacts, particularly in relation to GM crops, because I think that offers the best illustration of where the regulatory system, or I should say broken regulatory systems, can actually impact farmer-level choice. I apologize for my froggy voice. As you can tell, I'm a little bit under the weather. I thought about doing a Bob Costas and staying home, but the topic is one that I have a lot of passion about, and so here I am. So hopefully between the head cold and the drugs that I'm on, you'll be able to hear me, and I'll actually make some sense. So the latter is debatable. I think we've heard from here that there's a lot of factors that influence farmer access to technologies, market systems and forces, whether or not there's infrastructure in place, institutional factors related to the presence of a viable extension service, impacts of public sector abilities to get technologies out versus the private sector, intellectual property rights in terms of actually even having technologies available in the first place. And I would argue that at least with respect to the GM technologies, that the regulatory policies are of primary importance. Now, the conventionally bred varieties have been introduced over the years with virtually no real safety review. They're evaluated, these new traits and crops from conventionally bred crops are evaluated for their efficacy and their performance to assess the desired trait or traits that were the objective of the breeding event in the first place. They're not really evaluated from a safety perspective, as it's assumed that they pose no additional health or environmental risks since the genetics are being manipulated within the species. Similarly, or dissimilarly, I should say, crop protection chemicals, synthetic crop protection chemicals, have for a long time had safety evaluation as a recognized part of their developmental cycle. And that's added to a lot of additional costs and times in terms of evaluating these products for their toxicological profile and their safety. But it's factored into the overall product development cost and cycle, and these costs are eventually built into the cost of the product in terms of its delivery to farmers and ultimately to consumers. With respect to GM varieties, the rate-limiting factors have really been a rate-limiting step, particularly in the developing world. And this is despite the fact that we've had nearly 2 decades of absolutely safe use with this technology, and the fact that it's become one of the fastest adopted ag technologies in history. And just to illustrate that point, from the recent ISA report of 2013, the total amount of biotech crop hectares increased 1,000-fold from 1.7 million in 1996 to 170 million in 2012. With these new crops, however, there have been an additional level of unique challenges with respect to jumping through the regulatory hurdles that are needed to get them into the marketplace. It's required a lot more money, a lot more time, and a lot of new skills, both in terms of the technical skills to evaluate these products as well as the outreach and communication skills to communicate the results of the safety analysis that have been done on them. And typically when companies or product developers are starting out on the developmental pathway to look at the creation of a new GM variety, they now have to take the regulatory considerations into the product development scenario first and foremost. They don't have the luxury of looking at this down the road. And even more important, they actually have to look at what the stakeholder scenario is going to be with relation to what this crop is and the impact it's going to have, particularly at the consumer level in the marketplace. So it's just created a whole additional level of complexity to try and get these products into the marketplace versus what we've been used to with conventionally bred technologies. Now, if you look at a map of the world, you'll see that Particularly in the Western Hemisphere, these products have been very, very robustly adopted. That's both in North and South America. And even in parts of Asia, we're seeing higher adoption rates. But it's no small coincidence that the lack of adoption in Europe has absolutely affected probably the most vulnerable food insecure continent on the world, and that's Africa. And I would argue that a lot of it is directly related to the regulatory attitudes in Europe, which have, as a result of the historical trade issues between Africa and Europe, spilled over into a very highly oriented, risk-averse attitude in Africa about this technology. Just to further illustrate another point about sort of juxtaposing the benefits of the technology to the regulatory issues and the impacts that the regulatory issues pose, I'll point out some work that was done by former IFPRI colleague Guillaume Gruyère when he was looking at the adoption of BT cotton in India. And when the technology was introduced in 2002 commercially in India, India quickly emerged as the second largest exporter of cotton in the world. The introduction led to a doubling of yields in 5 years. And concomitantly, there was also a decrease in insecticide sprays of 33% and an increase at profit per hectare of almost 71%. And yet, what is the situation currently in India? We basically have a GM moratorium, and there have been no additional products introduced since BT cotton was approved, despite the fact that there are some very promising products that could make a huge difference on the agriculture situation in India. So there's been a whole host of basically non-science issues that have impacted the regulatory discussion, ranging from the threats of trade retaliation to the fact that a lot of the first-generation products didn't have outward consumer benefit, the fact that there's technological disparity between the countries that have been driving this technology and those such as Africa, where the technology could do a lot of benefit, but the technology knowledge really isn't there. There's a lack of science literacy on the part of the public. There's a lot of religious and cultural concerns about it. Food system control, consumer right to know, and not to be mentioning it last, but the Cartagena Protocol, which has gone way beyond the scope of what it was originally intended to be and has become a de facto regulatory system for a large part of the world. So the result is that we've had a lot of trade disruptions with respect to GM technology, market rejection, and most importantly, regulatory impacts and delay. It's been particularly chilling in Africa. If you look at the time frame of 2008 to 2013, the number of commercial introductions in Africa basically were 3 and 3. 3 countries only adopted in 2008, and here in 2013, still only 3. And even in terms of experimental field trials, 4 and 6, which is a woeful situation when you consider the number of countries and the challenges that are being faced. In terms of the specific impact of the regulatory issues on the ability to get these products out into the farmers' hands, despite the fact that there's been a lot of technical capacity and products which have been dovetailed to actually meet the situation and need in Africa, there's still been a lot of uneven progress because of the regulatory lags. Many of these countries have been at it for 15 or 20 years trying to get a product approved. They're stuck on what I like to call the confined field trial treadmill, and they never actually get something out into the hands of a farmer. The systems are expensive, they're unpredictable, they're subject to a lot of political intervention. They're focused on risk, which is not in line with the global experience. There's a lack of expertise on the ground to actually test and evaluate. There's interministerial turf, most likely coming down on the lines between environment ministries and agriculture ministries. There's a lack of resources, lack of adequate information to inform particularly the political process, and most importantly, a lack of political will to move forward. So in terms of how you move forward to get a regulatory system in place, you really have to figure out what the goal is and the objective, and then adopt a system which is going to meet that. If your goal is to use this new technology to improve the agriculture system, then the regulatory system has to reflect that. And it has to be reconciled with other laws, and there has to be a broad impact across all ministries who are making decisions about the policies, and there has to be adequate training. It's important to have an integrated approach. You just can't focus on the technical, but you also have to look at the communications piece of it. And patience is extremely important. This requires long-term engagement. And the involvement of women as the major producers of food around the world has been a neglected part of the policy discussion with respect to GM, and that's something that definitely needs to change. So I'll thank you.